It was a crisp autumn evening in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind where perfectly trimmed lawns stretched out in front of well-maintained houses. The streetlights had just flickered on, casting a warm glow on the empty sidewalks. Two distinguished men in business suits were driving home from a 3-day law enforcement leadership conference, discussing the new community policing strategies they'd learned about. The black luxury sit-in glided smoothly down the street, maintaining perfect speed. Inside, the two police captains were tired but satisfied after the productive conference. The driver, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and 25 years of service under his belt, was telling his colleague about his daughter's upcoming college graduation. His passenger, who had served the force for nearly 2 decades, nodded along while checking his phone for messages from his son's basketball coach. Neither of them noticed the patrol car that had started following them 3 blocks back. They had no reason to. They weren't speeding, their tags were current, and both taillights worked perfectly. But the patrol car's red and blue lights suddenly burst to life, filling their rearview mirror with flashing colors. "That's odd," the driver said, glancing at his speedometer one more time. He did everything by the book, signal on, slowly pulling to the curb, hands visible on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. His passenger already had his department ID ready, along with his license, following the same protocols they'd taught countless rookie officers. Through the side mirror, they watched as Officer Mitchell approached, his hand resting unnecessarily on his holster. His flashlight beam swept aggressively across the car's interior, momentarily blinding both men. The way he walked, the aggressive stance, the tight grip on the flashlight. Everything screamed hostility rather than professional caution. "License and registration," Mitchell barked, without introducing himself or stating the reason for the stop. His voice carried that edge of authority that some officers use when they're looking for trouble rather than trying to keep the peace. "Good evening, officer," the driver responded calmly, maintaining his professional demeanor. "I'm Captain." "I didn't ask for your life story," Mitchell cut him off sharply. "Papers. Now." The tension in the air thickened like smoke. Both captains exchanged a quick glance, their decades of law enforcement experience telling them something wasn't right. The driver reached slowly for his credentials, making sure his movements were deliberate and visible. A small crowd had started to gather on the sidewalk, drawn by the flashing lights and the unusually aggressive tone of the officer's voice. A few people had their phones out, recording the scene, a common sight these days when any traffic stop could turn into tomorrow's viral video. "Step out of the vehicle," Mitchell demanded, hardly glancing at the police credentials being presented to him. His hand was still hovering near his weapon, even though both men were clearly showing their police IDs. "Officer," the passenger tried to reason, his voice steady and professional, "there seems to be a misunderstanding. We're Both. I set out. Both of you." Mitchell's voice rose sharply, echoing off the nearby houses. More lights were coming on in nearby homes, more curious faces appearing in windows. What should have been a routine traffic stop, if there had been any legitimate reason for one, was quickly spiraling into something else entirely. The two captains shared another look, both recognizing the dangerous crossroads they were approaching. They had trained countless officers on how to handle traffic stops properly, how to de-escalate tense situations, how to maintain professionalism even in difficult circumstances. Now they found themselves on the other side of that equation, facing an officer who seemed determined to ignore every principle of professional police conduct. As they carefully followed the officer's instructions, both men knew this night was about to become much longer than they planned. Neither could have guessed just how far-reaching the consequences of this traffic stop would become, not just for them, but for their entire department and community. The two police captains stepped out of their car into the cool night air, their polished dress shoes crunching softly on the asphalt. The blue and red lights kept flashing, painting everything in alternating colors. More neighbors had gathered now, watching from their front yards, their faces showing concern at the scene unfolding before them. Hands where I can see them, Officer Mitchell barked. Even though both men already had their hands raised, department IDs still clutched in their fingers. The beam of his flashlight bounced between them, casting harsh shadows across their faces. Spread your legs, hands on the hood. The driver, the more senior of the two captains, tried one more time to reason with the officer. Sir, if you just take a moment to verify our credentials. I said hands on the hood. Mitchell's voice cracked like a whip. You trying to resist? A young woman in the growing crowd gasped audibly. Several more phones came out, their camera lights adding to the surreal illumination of the scene. The captains could hear whispered conversations, people wondering why such respected-looking men in business suits were being treated this way. Both captains complied, decades of law enforcement experience telling them that this situation needed to be handled delicately. They assumed the position, their expensive suits pressing against the warm hood of their car. The driver caught his reflection in the polished black paint. A high-ranking police captain with nearly 3 decades of service, being treated like a common criminal. Mitchell approached the passenger side captain first, roughly patting him down. You think that fake police ID is gonna work? I've seen better fakes in the dollar store. His hands were unnecessarily rough as he checked the captain's pockets, ignoring the standard procedures for a respectful pat-down. The passenger captain kept his voice steady, professional. Officer, you can easily verify our identities with dispatch. One phone call. Shut it. Mitchell snapped, moving to search the driver. I've heard every excuse in the book. 2 guys in fancy suits, fake badges, probably casing the neighborhood. A police cruiser turned onto the street, backup arriving. The new officer stepped out, a look of confusion crossing his face as he took in the scene. He was younger than Mitchell, and his eyes widened as he got closer and recognized the men bent over the car. Mitchell, the backup officer, called out, his voice uncertain. Those badges. These guys are trying to impersonate officers. Mitchell cut him off, pulling out his handcuffs. Probably got those badges off the internet. We're taking them in. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing the captains, but struggling with how to handle the situation. Sir, I think. The passenger captain turned his head slightly toward the new officer. Son, please call the station and ask for the watch commander. He can verify our identities. Mitchell yanked the captain's arm back. I said quiet. You're both under arrest for impersonating police officers and resisting arrest. The crowd had grown larger, and angry murmurs rippled through it. Someone shouted, "This isn't right." Another voice called out, "We're recording everything." The driver captain remained calm as the cold steel of handcuffs closed around his wrists. He taught countless classes on maintaining composure under pressure, and now he was living those lessons. His eyes met those of the young backup officer, who looked increasingly distressed. As Mitchell reached for his second pair of handcuffs, the passenger captain spoke quietly, not to the officers, but to the gathering crowd. Please make sure those videos don't get deleted. The truth needs to be seen. The backup officer finally found his voice. Mitchell, wait, I know these men. There. But Mitchell was already reciting the Miranda rights, his voice drowning out his colleagues' protests. The crowd's phones captured everything. The unnecessary roughness, the ignored protests, the looks of disbelief on people's faces, and most importantly, the dignified composure of the two captains who knew that sometimes justice takes a longer route to arrive. As they were led to the patrol car, both captains knew this night would change things, not just for them, but for the entire department. Sometimes the most powerful lessons about justice come from its temporary absence. Things took a sharp turn for the worse when Mitchell started pushing both captains toward his patrol car. The backup officer kept glancing between his radio and the scene unfolding before him, clearly torn between following the chain of command and doing what he knew was right. One of the captains shifted slightly, trying to keep his balance as he was pushed forward. His expensive dress shoes weren't made for being shoved around on asphalt. Mitchell immediately took this as an excuse to escalate. "Stop resisting," he shouted, though anyone watching could see there was no resistance at all. "We're complying fully, officer," the older captain said calmly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who trained hundreds of officers in proper procedure. "There's no need for this level of force." The growing crowd had become a sea of glowing phone screens and concerned faces. A middle-aged woman in a nursing uniform who'd just gotten home from her shift spoke up. "Those men aren't resisting at all. Why are you treating them like this?" Mitchell spun around, pointing a finger at the crowd. "Everyone needs to step back. This is police business." "It's public property," someone else called out. "We have the right to record." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The backup officer finally made his decision and stepped away, speaking urgently into his radio. But Mitchell wasn't paying attention to his colleague anymore. He was too busy putting on a show of authority, making a point that was becoming more disturbing by the minute. As he roughly searched the captains again, even though he'd already done so at the car, his hand brushed against something in the passenger captain's pocket. "What's this?" he demanded, pulling out a phone. "That's my department-issued phone," the captain explained patiently. "As I've been trying to tell you." "Could be evidence." Mitchell cut him off, but as he grabbed for the phone, his finger accidentally pressed the screen, activating the voice recorder that had been running for the past few minutes. His own voice played back clearly in the quiet street. "You people always think you can fool me with fake IDs." Mitchell's face changed as he realized he'd been recorded. The backup officer, who'd just finished his radio call, heard it too. His eyes went wide, and he quickly stepped closer to the scene. A police sergeant's car turned onto the street, lights flashing but no siren. Then another patrol car, and another. The cavalry was arriving, but not the kind Mitchell had been expecting. The first sergeant to step out took one look at the handcuffed captains, and his face went through about 5 different emotions in 3 seconds. "Dear God," he muttered, then raised his voice. "Mitchell, stand down. Release those officers immediately." But Mitchell wasn't going down without a fight. "Sir, these men were impersonating officers." "That's Captain Reynolds you have in cuffs." The sergeant's voice boomed across the street. "He taught my academy class 15 years ago." The backup officer finally found his courage. "I tried to tell you," he said to Mitchell. "If you just listened." The crowd watched in satisfaction as more ranking officers arrived. The handcuffs were quickly removed from both captains, who maintained their professional demeanor even as Mitchell's face turned various shades of red and white. The older captain rolled his shoulders, easing the stiffness from having his arms bound. He looked at Mitchell, not with anger, but with something closer to pity. "Officer," he said quietly, "every moment of this stop has been recorded, both by these good citizens and by the phone you just discovered. I suggest you take a moment to think about your next words very carefully." The gathering of police officers had turned into an impromptu command staff meeting right there on the street. The sergeants were already taking statements from witnesses, collecting video evidence, and trying to restore some dignity to the situation. One young officer brought the captains suit jackets from their car, handling them with the kind of respect that had been sorely missing minutes before. The crowd began to disperse, but not before making sure their videos were safely backed up to the cloud. This was one incident that wasn't going to be swept under the rug. Mitchell stood alone now, his backup long since pulled away by a sergeant for a statement. He watched as his entire career began crumbling around him, all because he couldn't see past his own prejudices on a quiet suburban street. The police station buzzed with unusual energy that night. Word spread like wildfire through the building as officers and staff whispered about the incident. 2 well-respected captains brought in like common criminals. It was unheard of. The desk sergeant, a veteran of 20 years, couldn't believe his eyes when he saw them walk in. What in the world? He stood up from his desk, recognizing the captains immediately. The older captain had signed his promotion papers just last month. Several officers in the booking area stopped what they were doing, staring in disbelief. Mitchell pushed forward, still trying to maintain control of a situation that had already spiraled far beyond his grasp. These suspects were impersonating police officers, he announced to the room, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. The desk sergeant's face turned from confusion to shock to anger in the span of seconds. "Officer Mitchell," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "those suspects are the heads of our major crimes and internal affairs divisions." The booking area fell so silent you could hear a pin drop. A young officer who'd been filling out paperwork actually dropped her pen, the small sound echoing in the hushed room. Mitchell's face went pale as the reality of his situation finally started to sink in. Just then, the station doors burst open. The police chief himself walked in, still wearing his dinner jacket, clearly called away from some event. His face was a thundercloud of contained fury. Behind him came 3 internal affairs officers, their expressions equally grim. "Get those cuffs off them right now," the chief ordered, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. Mitchell fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking slightly as he released the captains. The older captain rubbed his wrists but maintained his composure. His younger colleague was already pulling out his phone, which had recorded everything from the moment Mitchell first approached their car. The audio played clearly in the quiet room. Mitchell's aggressive tone, his refusal to check their credentials, the prejudiced comments he'd made during the arrest. "Chief," the younger captain said quietly, "we have a situation that needs immediate attention." He gestured toward a private office, but the chief shook his head. "No," the chief replied firmly. "This happens right here, right now. The entire department needs to witness this." He turned to the gathering crowd of officers. "Everyone present is to stay right where they are. What happened tonight is a teaching moment for our entire force." Mitchell stood awkwardly to the side, his usual swagger completely gone. The backup officer who'd been present at the scene was already giving his statement to Internal Affairs, his young face troubled as he described how he'd recognized the captains but hesitated too long to intervene. The chief addressed the room. "What happened tonight is exactly what we've been working to eliminate from our force. 2 highly respected officers were profiled, disrespected, and arrested for nothing more than driving while black in an affluent neighborhood." One of the internal affairs officers was reviewing the videos that witnesses had already uploaded to their department's tip line. The footage played on his tablet, showing Mitchell's aggressive behavior, the dignified responses of the captains, and the growing outrage of the community members who witnessed it all. "Sir," Mitchell tried to speak up, "I was just following." "Following what?" The chief cut him off. "Not procedure, not training, not department policy. So please, Officer Mitchell, enlighten us all about exactly what you were following tonight." The silence that followed was deafening. Officers around the room shifted uncomfortably, some avoiding eye contact, others watching intently as this pivotal moment unfolded in their department's history. The older captain stepped forward, straightening his suit jacket. "Chief, if I may." He waited for the chief's nod before continuing. "What happened tonight isn't just about one officer. It's about a system that sometimes fails to recognize its own flaws. Let's use this as an opportunity for real change." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Everyone in that room knew they were witnessing something that would transform their department forever. The next few hours would involve formal statements, paperwork, and the beginning of what promised to be a thorough investigation. But right then, in that moment, a powerful lesson was being learned by every officer present. The next morning, the police station was a hive of activity. Internal affairs officers moved through the building with purpose, collecting files and conducting interviews. The story had spread through local news channels, and reporters gathered outside like bees around honey, their cameras ready to capture any development in this explosive story. Inside the chief's office, a tense meeting was underway. The 2 captains sat across from the chief, their presence commanding respect despite the previous night's humiliation. Spread across the desk were printouts of Mitchell's arrest records, civilian complaints, and performance reviews. "This goes deeper than we thought," the internal affairs captain said, pointing to a pattern in the records. "Look at these traffic stops over the past year. The racial disparity is striking." He spread out more papers, each one revealing a troubling picture of systematic bias. The chief leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. How did we miss this? It wasn't really a question, but rather a painful acknowledgement of a system that had failed to police itself. A knock on the door interrupted them. The department's data analyst entered, carrying a thick folder. "Sir, you need to see this," she said, laying out statistical charts. "Officer Mitchell's arrest records show a clear pattern. Over 80% of his discretionary stops involved minority drivers, while our district's demographic makeup is nothing close to that." The older captain studied the numbers carefully. "And look at the times and locations," he pointed out. "Most of these stops happened in or near upper middle-class neighborhoods, just like ours last night." Another knock brought more revelations. The HR director stepped in, looking troubled. "We found something concerning in Mitchell's employment history," she said, placing a file on the already crowded desk. "He was dismissed from 2 other departments before joining ours. Somehow, this information was overlooked during his hiring." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The chief picked up the file, his face darkening as he read. Both dismissals were related to misconduct similar to last night's incident. He managed to hide this by using slightly different variations of his name on the applications. Outside the office, the regular buzz of police work continued, but there was an undercurrent of tension. Officers gathered in small groups, discussing the events in hushed tones. Some defended Mitchell, claiming he was just being thorough. Others shook their heads, knowing that what happened was indefensible. The desk sergeant from the previous night approached the chief's office with another update. Community members had been calling all morning, offering their video evidence and witness statements. Some were longtime residents who'd had similar experiences with Mitchell, but had never filed formal complaints, thinking they wouldn't be taken seriously. "The community response has been overwhelming," the sergeant reported. "People want to know that we're taking this seriously. They're watching us closely." The younger captain stood up, straightening his tie. "This is our chance," he said, looking at each person in the room. "Not just to address one incident or one officer, but to show our community that we can acknowledge our mistakes and make real changes." The chief nodded slowly. "We start with a full review of all Mitchell's cases," he decided. "Every arrest, every stop, every interaction. And we don't stop there. We need to look at our hiring process, our oversight procedures, our training programs." Just then, a young officer burst into the room, tablet in hand. "Chief, you need to see this." She turned the screen around, showing a social media post that was rapidly going viral. Someone had compiled clips from multiple witnesses' videos, showing the entire incident from different angles. The comment section was exploding with similar stories from other communities. The older captain watched the video play out, seeing himself and his colleague being mistreated all over again. But instead of anger, his expression showed determination. "This isn't just about Mitchell anymore," he said quietly. "This is about making sure it never happens again, to anyone." The room fell silent again, but this time it was different. This was the silence of people realizing they stood at a turning point, understanding that their response to this incident would define their department for years to come. The internal affairs investigation moved at lightning speed. By mid-afternoon, investigators had taken over one of the larger conference rooms, its walls now covered with timeline charts and case files. The evidence against Mitchell was mounting by the hour, each new discovery more troubling than the last. A young detective burst into the room, waving a stack of papers. "You won't believe what we found in the old complaint files," she said, spreading the documents on the table. "Over the past 3 years, There were 27 civilian complaints against Mitchell that were never properly investigated. They were all marked as resolved without any actual follow-up. The internal affairs captain leaned forward, examining the complaints. Each one told a similar story: unnecessary stops, aggressive behavior, discriminatory comments. But something else caught his eye. "Look at the signature on these dismissals," he said, pointing to a recurring name. They were all handled by the same supervisor. In another part of the building, the technology team was reviewing dashcam footage from Mitchell's previous stops. The patterns were impossible to ignore. The same aggressive approach, the same dismissal of civil rights, the same targeting of minorities in upscale neighborhoods. "Pull up his patrol patterns," one analyst suggested. The computer screen filled with a map showing dots where Mitchell had made his stops. It painted a clear picture. He'd been deliberately patrolling the borders of wealthy neighborhoods, targeting drivers who he thought didn't belong. Meanwhile, the chief was dealing with a growing media storm. News vans lined the street outside, and phones were ringing off the hook with calls from reporters. But it was a call from the mayor that really turned up the heat. "The whole city is watching," the mayor said through the speakerphone. "This incident has opened up a lot of old wounds. People want answers, and they want action." The chief looked out his window at the gathering crowd of protesters holding signs demanding police accountability. "They'll get both," he promised. "We're not just looking at one officer anymore. We're examining our entire system." Back in the conference room, the investigation had uncovered something even more disturbing. The HR team discovered that Mitchell's previous dismissals from other departments hadn't just been overlooked. They'd been actively hidden. Someone in the hiring process had helped cover up his history. "This goes beyond one bad officer," the older captain said, reviewing the findings. "We have a systemic failure here. The question is, how deep does it go?" The younger captain was working with community leaders who'd been sharing their experiences. More people were coming forward, describing similar encounters not just with Mitchell, but with other officers as well. Each story added another piece to a troubling puzzle. A senior investigator walked in with another revelation. "We found his old partner from his previous department," she announced. "He's willing to talk. Says he reported Mitchell's behavior multiple times but was told to keep quiet. Eventually transferred out rather than be complicit." The afternoon wore on, and the evidence continued to pile up. Mitchell's record wasn't just about racial profiling anymore. It had evolved into a complex web of misconduct, cover-ups, and institutional failures that had allowed a problem officer to continue working despite numerous red flags. In the break room, officers discussed the situation in hushed tones. Some were angry at Mitchell for tarnishing their badge. Others were more concerned about the system that had protected him. A rookie officer summed it up best: "How can we expect the community to trust us if we can't even police ourselves?" The sun was setting when the chief called another meeting. The room was packed with department heads, investigators, and both captains. The evidence filled dozens of files, each one representing a failure of the system to protect the people it served. "Tomorrow," the chief announced, "we go public with everything we found. Complete transparency. No sugarcoating. Our community deserves nothing less." He looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes. "This stops now. Not just Mitchell, but everything his case has revealed. We're going to fix this, no matter what it takes." The room fell quiet as everyone absorbed the magnitude of what lay ahead. This wasn't just about punishing one officer anymore. It was about rebuilding an entire system from the ground up. The next morning, the department's press conference room was packed wall to wall with reporters, community leaders, and concerned citizens. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Camera flashes popped like lightning as the chief stepped up to the podium, flanked by both captains and the head of internal affairs. "What happened 3 nights ago was not just an isolated incident," the chief began, his voice firm and clear. Our investigation has uncovered a pattern of behavior that goes against everything our badge stands for. He paused, making eye contact with the crowd. But more troubling than one officer's actions is what our investigation revealed about the system that allowed it to happen. Gasps filled the room as the chief began sharing the findings. Pictures appeared on the screen behind him. Statistical charts showing the racial disparity in Mitchell's stops, maps revealing his targeting patterns, and documentation of complaints that had been swept under the rug. A veteran reporter raised her hand. "Are you saying this officer had a history of similar incidents at other departments?" The older captain stepped forward. "Yes, and that's perhaps the most troubling part. Not only did Officer Mitchell have a history of misconduct at 2 previous departments, but someone within our hiring process helped conceal this information." The room erupted with questions. Cameras clicked frantically, and reporters spoke over each other trying to get answers. But it was a local community activist question that cut through the chaos. "How do we know this won't happen again?" The younger captain took the microphone. "Because of this," he said, holding up a thick document. "This is our comprehensive reform plan. Every single policy, from hiring to complaint investigation, is being overhauled. But more importantly, we're creating new oversight committees that will include community members." The chief went on to explain how Mitchell's case had exposed serious flaws in their system. The supervisor who had dismissed complaints without investigation had been placed on administrative leave. The hiring officer who helped cover up Mitchell's past was under investigation. But the changes wouldn't stop there. "We're implementing mandatory body camera reviews," the chief announced. "Every traffic stop, every interaction will be monitored. No more dismissed complaints, no more hidden patterns of behavior." A young reporter raised her hand. "What about Officer Mitchell himself?" The room grew quiet. The chief's expression hardened. "Officer Mitchell has been terminated, effective immediately. Additionally, we're forwarding our findings to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges related to civil rights violations." In the back of the room, several community members nodded in approval. An elderly gentleman who'd lived in the community for decades wiped tears from his eyes. He'd filed one of those dismissed complaints against Mitchell 2 years ago. The internal affairs captain stepped up next, explaining how they discovered that Mitchell had been targeting specific neighborhoods during specific times, deliberately profiling drivers who he thought didn't belong in upscale areas. "But here's what's different now," he said, his voice carrying conviction. "We're not just removing one officer. We're changing the culture that allowed this to happen. Every complaint will be investigated. Every pattern will be analyzed. And most importantly, every voice will be heard." A community leader stood up, her voice trembling with emotion. "Some of us have been trying to tell you about these problems for years. Why should we believe anything will change now?" The older captain, still bearing the memory of his own humiliation at Mitchell's hands, responded with quiet dignity. "Because this time, we felt it ourselves. This time, we're not just giving lip service to change. We're living proof of why it's necessary." He gestured to the crowd. Every person who shared their story, every witness who came forward, every officer who finally spoke up about what they'd seen. You've all helped expose a problem that we can no longer ignore. And we won't stop until we've earned back your trust. As the press conference continued, phones buzzed throughout the room as news outlets began broadcasting live. Social media exploded with clips and quotes. This wasn't just a local story anymore. It was becoming a national conversation about police reform, accountability, and the long road to rebuilding community trust. The story exploded across national news networks by evening. Every major channel ran the footage of the 2 captains being wrongfully arrested, followed by clips from the department's candid press conference. Social media couldn't get enough of it, not just because of the incident itself, but because of how the department was handling it. The chief's phone hadn't stopped ringing. Police departments from across the country were calling, wanting to know more about the reforms being implemented. This could be a model for departments nationwide, One police commissioner said during a video call, "You're turning a terrible incident into real, meaningful change." In the department's main conference room, both captains led the first of many new training sessions. Officers filled every seat, with some standing along the walls. The mood was different now. There was an openness, a willingness to learn that hadn't been there before. "Let me be clear," the older captain said, standing before his colleagues. "What happened to us that night happens to citizens every day. The only difference is we had the authority to make sure it didn't get swept under the rug. Now it's our responsibility to make sure it never happens to anyone else." The younger captain clicked to the next slide, showing Mitchell's patrol patterns. "Look at these areas," he pointed out. These weren't random stops. This was systematic targeting, and we all saw it happening. How many of us stayed quiet because it was easier than speaking up? A veteran officer raised his hand, his face troubled. "I worked the same shift as Mitchell last year," he admitted. "I saw how he treated people, but I told myself it wasn't my business. I was wrong. We were all wrong." Meanwhile, in another part of the building, the internal affairs team was implementing new oversight procedures. Every complaint would now be reviewed by a panel that included community members. Body camera footage would be regularly audited, not just when complaints were filed. The department's tech team was rolling out new software that would flag patterns in officers' behavior. Unusual concentrations of stops in certain areas, disparities in how different groups were treated, excessive force incidents. "We're not just looking for bad apples anymore," the tech supervisor explained. "We're examining the whole orchard." Community meetings were happening too. The department's community room was packed with residents sharing their stories, many for the first time. Some spoke of similar encounters they'd had with Mitchell, others about incidents with different officers. But now, instead of being dismissed, they were being heard. An elderly woman stood up, leaning on her cane. "I've lived here for 40 years, she said, her voice shaking. "My grandson was stopped 3 times in 1 month just for driving through his own neighborhood. Today is the first time I feel like someone's actually listening." The district attorney's office had set up a special task force to review Mitchell's past cases. Hundreds of arrests and citations would need to be examined. If we find that any arrests were made without proper cause, the DA announced, "we'll work to make it right." Back at the training session, officers were engaging in frank discussions about bias, power, and responsibility. The atmosphere was different from previous diversity trainings. This wasn't just about checking boxes anymore. This was real. "I never thought it could happen to someone as high-ranking as you," a rookie officer admitted to the captains. "It really shows that this isn't about how you dress or what position you hold. It's about assumptions and prejudices that run deep." The older captain nodded. "That's exactly right. And that's why change has to start with each of us. Every traffic stop, every interaction, every decision we make, we have to ask ourselves why we're making it." As evening fell, the chief stood at his office window, watching officers change shifts. The protests outside had turned into community gatherings, with residents and officers actually talking to each other, sharing stories, finding common ground. A news crew was setting up for the evening broadcast, their headline reading, "Local police department's response to racial profiling incident becomes national model for reform." But the chief knew headlines weren't enough. Real change would take time, commitment, and constant vigilance. On his desk lay Mitchell's badge and gun, turned in that morning without a word. Next to them sat hundreds of emails from other departments, asking for guidance on implementing similar reforms. The incident that started with one officer's prejudice was turning into a movement for change that no one had expected. 6 months had passed since that fateful night, and the police department had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The two captains stood in front of a packed auditorium at the National Police Leadership Conference, sharing their story and the changes it had sparked. "When we were handcuffed that night," the older captain began, his voice carrying across the silent room, we had two choices. We could let anger consume us, or we could use this experience to create real change. We chose change. The screen behind them showed impressive statistics from their reform department. Civilian complaints had dropped by 60%. Community trust ratings had soared. Officer morale was at an all-time high, but the numbers told only part of the story. The younger captain clicked to a video montage of their new community programs. Officers were having coffee with residents, playing basketball with kids in the parks, and attending neighborhood meetings. More importantly, they were listening, really listening, to the people they served. The biggest change wasn't in our policies, he explained. It was in our mindset. We stopped seeing ourselves as warriors and started being guardians. Real guardians who protect everyone equally. Their department had become a model for others across the country. The new hiring process they developed was being adopted nationwide. Their complaint investigation system, which included civilian oversight, had been praised by civil rights organizations. Even their training programs were being copied by other departments. In the audience, chiefs and commanders from other cities took notes furiously. This wasn't just theory. This was real change with real results. Remember that young officer who was Mitchell's backup that night? The older captain asked. He now leads our new officer mentorship program. He teaches rookies that having the courage to speak up against wrongdoing is just as important as having the courage to face danger. The presentation shifted to their new technology initiatives. Every patrol car now had eye-assisted cameras that flagged potential bias in real time. Officers wore body cameras that couldn't be turned off during interactions with the public. But technology was just a tool. The real change was in the culture. A slide showed their weekly community meetings where residents and officers sat together, sharing concerns and solutions. These aren't just talk sessions, the younger captain explained. Every suggestion is logged, tracked, and acted upon. When people see their input making real changes, trust grows. They shared stories of officers who'd initially resisted the changes but had become their strongest advocates. Like the veteran sergeant who'd admitted his own biases and now led anti-bias training sessions. Or the patrol officer who'd started a program helping young people understand their rights during police interactions. The older captain's voice softened as he shared a personal story. Last week, I was driving through the same neighborhood where we were arrested. A young officer pulled me over for a broken taillight. But this time was different. He was professional, respectful, and focused on safety rather than suspicion. That's when I knew, really knew, that we'd made progress. The presentation ended with a powerful image. Their old police academy class photo side by side with their newest recruit class. A diverse group that better reflected their community. This isn't just about removing bad officers, the younger captain concluded. It's about building a better department that serves everyone equally. As they finished speaking, the auditorium erupted in applause. Police leaders from across the country lined up to ask questions and request guidance. But the most touching moment came when an elderly officer approached the stage, tears in his eyes. I've been on the force for 30 years, he said, his voice breaking. What happened to you could have been just another incident swept under the rug. Instead, you turned it into a movement that's changing policing across the country. Back home, their department continued to evolve. The building that once housed rows of silent officers now buzzed with community members freely walking in and out. The walls that were once bare now displayed photos of officers and residents working together, building bridges that had seemed impossible just months ago. Mitchell's old patrol car had been repurposed for community outreach, a powerful symbol of how something negative could be transformed into a force for good. And every new officer who joined the force heard the story of that night. Not as a cautionary tale, but as a testament to how authentic change begins with acknowledging wrongs and working tirelessly to make them right.